you the Sweetwise method of covering a cake in fondant. I think you're going to find a lot of great advantages to it, whether you're a seasoned professional or a beginner. I think you're really going to love this method. This method includes a tool that we like to refer to just as the mat. It is not like any general purpose vinyl that you can find at a craft or fabric store. You need to know that it's absolutely food safe. We have this manufactured and we have it done thousands of pounds at a time. We know that it's made with food safe, FDA approved ingredients. It's made on a food safe surface so that it doesn't contain any heavy metals or toxic ingredients that you might find in other general purpose vinyls. Also, because it's made to our specifications, it has a highly buffed surface that works really great with the fondant, and I'll show you how that works later on. Another great advantage to using the mat method is that it's dust-free. You're saving the cost on cornstarch or confectioner sugar because you're not using it. You're also saving labor because you don't have to clean it up afterwards. Next, you don't want to change the recipe by adding dust. If you're working with a really good quality fondant or you've made a really great recipe yourself, you don't want to go and change that by adding an additional ingredient like dust, cornstarch, or confectioner sugar, right? The last thing is that it doesn't dry out the fondant. I see so many people encounter elephant skin when they're covering cakes in fondant, and that's just made worse when you add dust to it. So if you can use a dust-free method like the mat, then you're going to encounter less chance of seeing that elephant skin later on. The first time you use the mat, you'll want to season it. And how you do that is pull the top sheet back, put a light coat of shortening all over the interior of the mat, and then go back with a lint-free cloth and just wipe that off. What that does is it just seals the pores and seasons the mat. You don't want to do that every time you use it, just the very first time. The next thing you'll want to do is get your fondant out and make sure you knead it to where it's nice and soft. You don't want to work with a stiff fondant. It's going to make it harder work later on. So just get it nice and soft. I already got a head start on mine, so I'm just going to get started on rolling it out. You just want to get it into a nice disc shape and then roll down the top mat. This top piece does a couple of things. First, it insulates the mat from all of the outside air. So if you were rolling out here on your countertop, all this air up here is just sucking the moisture out of that fondant. Here it's sealed and it's going to stay nice and moist, just like it came out of the bucket and you kneaded it. The second thing that does is it keeps it nice and sanitary. You don't have, little hair particles or lint coming out onto the fondant, so it keeps it nice and clean and sanitary. Any rolling pin works for rolling out your fondant, but you need to remember that the heavier it is, the better. I like my sil pin, but again, your preference on what you have at the house or what works for you. What I like to do is I like to roll my fondant out in kind of a starburst shape. I don't like to go north to south like this. I like to go from the center out. That keeps you from having a fat middle and thin ends, so it has a nice even consistency throughout. So this is how that works. Center out, center out, center out. Now, you'll notice I'm not using the whole pin. I'm using just like the last few inches of the pin. What that does is it concentrates your energy into that end of the pin rather than spreading it out across this whole width so that you get more done with that same effort. Now, a great thing about the mat is that the fondant is going to stick for now, but it's going to release weight later when I tell it to. So I can basically just pick this up and turn it, and that way I don't have to chase it around the table to get a nice round shape. So again, continuing with the starburst shape, just going center out, using the last few inches of the pin. You see how easy this glides? It's nice. You can almost squeeze it with your hand because of that nice double polish that we've got on this surface. So we'll continue with the pin. Again, you can pick it up and move it. If you ever have it grab, you know how we talked about it seasoning towards the beginning? If it ever grabs, especially when it's a newer set, you can pull that top sheet back and then just lay it back down and those little ripples will come right out. So what you want to do, if you're doing a round cake, you want to roll it into a round shape. Square cake, square shape. And you want to roll it an inch or two bigger than the size of the cake. So how you measure that is the diameter of the cake. So let's say you're doing an 8-inch round cake and it's 4 inches high. So you'd go 8 inches plus 4 plus 4 is 16 inches. And then you want to leave an extra inch or two for good measure. So I'm working with a 7-inch cake today. So I think that's about there. You'll see our deluxe set of these mats being distributed soon. Those have a printed scale on them so that you don't have to guess. Okay, so let's say you rolled out your fondant, that you cut up enough that you thought was enough for the cake, and it started getting like too thin and it wasn't enough to cover the cake. There's an easy way to fix that. If it were white, all you would have to do is add another little section of fondant right in the middle, and it's no big deal. You can roll it into the white fondant. But if you've got a specific color, it's really hard to get that shade again. With this mat, it's okay. You can just roll that right into the fondant, spread it out to make it nice and big, and you'll notice that from the other side, you still don't see it. So it's okay if you didn't get enough rolled out. We can fix it. So now we've got our fondant rolled out to the proper size to cover the cake. The thickness that I've gone for is about the same size as a cake board, which is about 1/8 of an inch. Some manufacturers suggest that you roll it out thicker than that, but one great advantage here is that you can save some money, which we all like to do, right? If you roll it out to 1/8 of an inch rather than 1/4 of an inch, you've just saved half your money going towards your food cost. But the bigger advantage to being able to roll it out thinner is that it gives a better mouthfeel. Some people love fondant, some people don't. But if you let the buttercream be the star, then you've got something that's not only beautiful to the eye, but also beautiful to the palate. So we're just about ready to move the fondant. Let me point out a couple of differences with the mat. One thing that I want to point out, with the traditional method of moving fondant, you would slide your arms underneath the fondant and move it onto the cake. A couple of things. That's stressful and it's not very sanitary. We're all pretty good at washing our hands, maybe even scrubbing our fingernails, but even if we wash our arms really, really well like a surgeon, there's still hair follicles there that trap bacteria. It's just not very sanitary. The next thing, probably most important to me, is that you're reducing the stress. Because this fondant is still stuck to the mat as you're moving it onto the cake, you're not so worried about it stretching apart or maybe your fingers going through it. You've got all the time in the world to move it onto the cake. The last thing I want to say about it being stuck to the mat as you move it onto the cake is that if you don't center it just right, it's okay, you get a free do-over. If you've laid the fondant onto the cake with the old-fashioned method, it gets tough to stretch it back out and move it and try to get it recentered. With the mat, you get a free do-over. So let's do it. So now we're going to actually move the fondant. I've got a buttercream coated cake here. It's not too thick, not too thin. I don't worry about it being perfectly smooth. I just don't want it too lumpy that's going to show underneath the fondant. So somewhat smooth, but don't knock yourself out. So I'm going to remove the top sheet of the mat and just roll that up and set it aside. You never want to fold these. If you get a fold crease in these, then it's going to forever show up in your fondant. You certainly don't want that. So just roll them when you store them. So now I've got my fondant on top of the bottom sheet. Okay, so let me show you where the magic happens. This is where I pick up the mat and it's going to absolutely stick to it. This is where you know that you don't have the stress of moving the fondant. You've got all the time in the world. It's really nice. So what I'm going to do, because it's clear, I can see through it, I'm going to line up the bottom of my circle with the back edge of the cake and lay it over the cake. Again, if you don't get it perfectly centered, you still have a chance, because it's still stuck to the mat, just to pull it back off, repair your buttercream, and start over without having to roll out the fondant all over again. So you notice that I have my cake sitting flat on the table rather than up on a turntable or up, say, on a coffee can or something. What I don't like is the weight of the fondant pulling and stretching itself so fast that you're fighting with gravity to get it quickly on the cake. I want to tell it how fast to stretch, and I want to be in control of how quickly it goes on the cake. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to use the weight of that fondant to my advantage at this point. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start the mat by pulling the fondant away from the mat slightly. Here is where I'm going to let the weight of the fondant pull itself off the mat more than I am pulling the mat away from the fondant. So what you want to do is, you're not rolling it up behind you, you're letting it fall behind you. So I'm going to put my hands here with fingers up and then use my thumb to pull this taut. You don't want to see any buckles like happens here. If you see that happening, just pull it taut right across there. And because of this super double polish that we have on this mat and the surface tension that I'm creating here, the fondant just rolls off. Again, it's pulling itself off the mat more than I'm pulling the mat away from the fondant. This is probably the most spectacular thing about the mat, is how easy it comes off. It's really going to reduce a lot of stress for you. The next thing you want to do is get the fondant adhered to the cake. So what I want to see you do first is if there's any air bubbles up here on top, just with clean hands, just rub those out. If you have one that's like kind of stuck in there, you can pick your fondant up a bit and kind of move it out with your hand like this. So with the rest of this, we'll refer to the excess fondant as a skirt. So I kind of want to see you fluff the skirt, and it's kind of moving itself out a bit at an angle from the cake. So what it's doing is taking its weight and kind of slowly taking shape to the cake. So next what you want to do is start adhering it to the sides of the cake. Cup your hands just slightly. What I see a lot of people do when they're self-taught or taught by other methods is that they'll see one side over here that looks really good and go ahead and adhere it all the way down the side. I don't want to see you do that. It causes problems later. What it does is it ends up pushing that fondant down here and back around to the back side where you're going to have to deal with it, and it's going to make puckers and pleats. So rather than see you do that, what I'd like to see is you go 1 inch down, cupping your hand all the way around the cake, and with the other hand what you're doing is continuing to fluff that skirt. It allows you to shape the fondant to the cake. And this method works just as well with a petal-shaped cake, with a square-shaped cake. Any shaped cake that you need, this method works. So continuing around 2 inches down, all the way around. Again, fluffing the skirt with my other hand like this. And that keeps it from sticking to the cake prematurely. Working down 3 inches down all the way around. Now when we get to the base of the cake, it needs a nice straight professional edge, which I don't have a straight edge on my hand. So what I'm going to use is my fondant smoother that has a straight edge down here. And just like I was rubbing my hand on the cake here, I'm going to use the fondant smoother to rub there down towards the bottom. So again, using my other hand to fluff the skirt, and then just pushing down. You see I'm almost pushing firm enough to make an indentation down here at the bottom. Now what I don't want to see you do, let me exaggerate something here. Here's where people make a mistake in covering a cake around the base. You run into these little pleats and puckers, and you're really tempted to just smash it down and then maybe have an intention of smoothing it out later. You just can't. I don't care how much you smooth, it's not going to work. So instead of doing that, what I'd rather see you do is pull it back out away from the cake, and as it's stretched out away from the cake, use the fondant smoother very slowly. Don't rush stretching it. Just kind of back and forth, and that stretches it into the shape of the cake. If there's anything you need to remember, remember that. If you don't be tempted to smash down a little pucker, just pull it back out from the cake and you can fix it. So once I have it down, adhered to the sides of the cake, I'm going to go around one good firm time, all the way around again, just to make sure it has a nice straight professional edge. You want to use a circular blade to trim off your excess. Don't try to use a sharp paring knife. I don't care how sharp it is, it's still going to tug at the fondant. So you want to have a blade that rolls, circular blade. So just right at the base of the cake where it meets the board, just do a single motion, working around the cake. You can come back and finish it from this side. Now with your excess fondant, you just want to pull it apart, and then you can flip it over, and if there's any crumbs, you can cut them out. If there's buttercream in there, it's fine to just knead back into the fondant. You can wrap this up and reuse it later. So just get all the air out of that and wrap it up nice and tight, and then you can go back and fix all your mistakes. If there's any shaping or kneading you need to do, chances are though, with this method, you're not going to need to do that. It's nice and smooth.